My name is Beth Ferris. I'm from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and I've been asked to moderate this panel. We're going to begin by looking at the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. I'll introduce the speakers now. They'll have about 10 to 12 minutes each so that we have time for discussion. And a reminder that the app on your phone has a space for you to indicate questions, and we've arranged to have somebody translate those, so if you want to write in Turkish. Also on the back of your ID card, name tag, there's the password for Wi-Fi if you want to connect with Wi-Fi. But we'll begin with Mazen AboulHosn, who's from International Organization for Migration here in Turkey. You have the full bios in your app, but he's worked on just about every major crisis from Lebanon to Haiti to Chad to Congo and then back again to Turkey after the Van earthquake. He'll begin by giving us an overview of the Global Compact for Migration, followed by Demetrios Papademetriou from the Migration Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. He'll be providing some more analysis of what this Global Compact for Migration actually means and possible implications for it. He was the founder of Migration Policy Institute, has worked on migration issues almost forever, and certainly is very well known in the field. Then we'll turn to the Global Compact for Refugees, and we'll begin with Kemal Kirişci from the Brookings Institution. He's the Senior Fellow and the TÜSİAD Senior Fellow and Director of the Turkey project there, and has worked a lot on Turkish policies, European policies as well, toward both migrants and refugees. And finally, we'll hear from Murat Erdoğan, who's head of the Migration and Integration Research Center at Turkish German University, and has done quite a bit of work traveling in both Germany and Turkey, looking at attitudes toward and by Syrian refugees, as well as other groups. So it looks like a great panel. They're all going to have the amazing challenge of speaking for only 10 to 12 minutes, and I'll give you a little sign when it's time so that we do have time for questions. But Mazen, we'll begin with you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the organizer for this opportunity to be here today. It is a great pleasure to be in a panel with inspiring academics. On 19 September 2016, heads of states and government came together for the first time ever at the global level within the UN General Assembly to discuss issues related to migration and refugees. This sent a powerful political message that migration and refugees matters had become major issues on the international agenda. In the adoption of the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants, the 193 UN member states recognized the need for a comprehensive approach to human mobility and enhanced cooperation at the global level. The Annex 2 of the New York Declaration set in motion a process of intergovernmental consultations and also negotiations toward the development of a global compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration, or what we call the GCM. This process concluded on the 10th of December 2018 with the adoption of the Global Compact by the majority of the UN member states at an intergovernmental conference in Marrakesh, followed closely by a formal endorsement by the UN General Assembly on the 19th of December 2018. Let's take a look. I think there is a presentation. I'm not sure if it, okay. So we can take a look inside the GCM at how it is formulated and key aspects of the document, mainly on the vision, the guiding principles, the objectives, commitment, and actions. The Global Compact is the first intergovernmentally negotiated agreement prepared under the auspices of the United Nations, and it covers all dimensions of international migration in a holistic and comprehensive manner. It is a kind of non-binding document that respects states' sovereign right to determine who enters and stays in their territory and demonstrate commitment to international cooperation on migration. It presents a significant opportunity to to improve the governance of migration, to address the challenges associated with today's migration, and to strengthen the contribution of migrants and migration to sustainable development. The Global Compact is framed in a way consistent with the target 10.7 of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. In terms of the vision, the GCM expresses the collective commitment to improve cooperation on international migration. It recognizes that migration has been part of human history throughout time and is a source of prosperity, innovation, and sustainable development. It rests on common understanding, acknowledge that the Compact is a product of unprecedented review of evidence and data gathered during an open, transparent, and inclusive process. It's based on shared responsibility and that a comprehensive approach is needed to optimize benefits and minimize risks to individuals and states. And we can say that also this is equally true with respect to the GCM Guiding Principle. These principles that you can see them on the screen, I will try to explain them very briefly. The Compact is people-centered. It carries a strong human dimension to it, inherent to migration experience itself. It places individual at the core. International cooperation. It is a non-legally binding cooperative framework that recognizes that no state can address migration on its own due to the transnational nature of the phenomenon. The Global Compact reaffirmed the sovereign right of states to determine their own migration plans in conformity with international law and based on their own realities and capacities, and this is something very important to note. The Global Compact recognized that respect for the rule of law, due process, and access to the justice are fundamental to all aspects of migration governance. As we mentioned before, the Global Compact is rooted in the 2030 Agenda and builds upon its recognition that migration is a multidimensional reality of major relevance for the sustainable development of country of origin, transit, and also the destination. By implementing the Global Compact, we ensure effective respect, protection, and fulfillment of the human rights of all the migrants, regardless of their migration status, across all stages of the migration cycle. It also reaffirmed the commitment to eliminate all forms of discrimination, including racism, xenophobia, and intolerance against migrants and their families. The Global Compact also ensured that the human rights of women, men, girls, and boys are respected at all stages of migration. It promotes existing international legal obligation in relation to the rights of child. And lastly, the Global Compact recognized that migration is a multidimensional reality that cannot be addressed by one government policy sector alone and requires a whole-of-government approach and also a whole-of-society approach involving all the relevant stakeholders in migration field. When it comes to the objective, as you can see on the screen, the GCM comprised 23 objectives. I will not mention all of them, but I have selected a few for your attention. First objective is to collect and utilize accurate and disaggregated data as a basis for evidence-based plans and issues. Second one, to provide accurate and timely information at all stages of migration. Third, to enhance availability and flexibility of pathways for regular migration. Another one, to save lives and establish coordinated international effort on the missing migrants. Another objective, to manage border in an integrated, secure, and coordinated manner. To eliminate all forms of discrimination and promote evidence-based public discourse to shape perception of migration, which is very important in our time. To coordinate and facilitate safe and dignified return and readmission, as well as sustainable reintegration. In summary, the objective of the GCM aims to mitigate the adverse factors that hinder people from building and maintaining sustainable livelihood in their countries of origin. It intends to reduce the risks and vulnerability migrants face at different stages of migration by respecting, protecting, and fulfilling their human rights and providing them with care and assistance. It also seeks to address the legitimate concern of communities while recognizing that societies are undergoing demographic, economic, social, and environmental changes at the different scales that may have implication for and result from migration. And also, it's trying to create a conducive condition that enable all the migrants to enrich the society through their human, economic, and social capacities, and thus to facilitate their contribution to sustainable development. So the question is, why the GCM so significant, and what it really means, and what it will change in the life of migrants after its adoption. I will leave this part maybe to professors, but from my side, 3 points. The GCM is significant as the first comprehensive agreement on migration developed through intergovernmental negotiation in the UN, an important new multilateral platform for action. It provides a blueprint for how states can best manage migration and cooperate more effectively with one another, and a roadmap to go there. It also represents an opportunity to improve the governance on international migration and more away from reactive approaches. These are all principles that our organization, International Organization for Migration, has long stood for. And if we look why the GCM is special, we can highlight 4 points. First one, the GCM balances the interest of states of origin, transit, and the destination. It represents broad agreement among all states that states should cooperate with one another on the management of migration. It also recognized that the human right of all migrants must be respected regardless of migration status, and that migrants are entitled to basic services regardless of migration status and without discrimination. It also states that migrants are important contributors to development, and that migration policy should be based on accurate data and evidence. Let's look at the implementation of the GCM. In December 2018, the Secretary General launched the UN Network on Migration, which is a UN system support for the implementation, follow-up, and review of the GCM. The network was established to improve cooperation and collaboration among UN agencies working on migration. It brings together a large part of the UN system, currently comprising 38 entities, which are so many, and then to work collectively to support state in advancing the collective goals and purpose of the GCM. The network operates with a small executive committees with key UN offices, which gives overall guidance and set priorities. The executive committees include ILO, IOM, OHCHR, UNDESA, UNDP, UNHCR, UNICEF, and UNODC, with IOM, its coordinator and secretariat. The network is more than just a headquarter, let's say, status. It is demand-driven with its true impact at country level through direct support to member states to implement the GCM. The network is accountable to the Secretary General and the General Assembly. In that regard, the network has established a work plan. The work plan will focus on key issues where the UN system can add value in delivering concrete results and supporting the GCM implementation. It reinforces the network commitment to work in partnership both within and outside the UN system, recognizing that no single actor has all the answers. And this is something very important because the network is not only the UN agency, but will be working with the whole society, including the academia, the civil society, and other entities. The plan has several thematic priorities, including on data, alternative to detention, returns and sustainable reintegration, access to services, addressing vulnerability, and labor migration. Additionally, the network has established the Trust Fund, which is a startup fund for initial or complementary financing for projects to support GCM implementation. Its aim is to be a catalytic force encouraging innovation and cooperation. The capitalization of the Migration Trust Fund is essential for the GCM implementation and a commitment to international cooperation on migration. It's good to note here that so far, the network has issued a statement on the child detention, the bombing of the migrant detention center in Libya, on the occasion of the World Day Against the Trafficking in Human Person, and the network will continue to speak with one voice on those issues of common concerns and where their joint voice can add value. For the 2019-2020, the network will focus on supporting the member state and the implementation, mainly on the implementation of the work plan that I have already mentioned. The first annual meeting of the network will take place on the 11th of December in Geneva, followed by a briefing for member states on the 12th of December. Supporting member state regional review of the GCM in 2020, including through the regional coordination mechanisms that have been established for reinvigorated since the inception of the network. Finalization of the inaugural steering committee in order to look at pipeline of potential projects from the migration Trust Fund support, and release the first SG reports on the GCM implementation in late 2020. Let me conclude by stating two things. By reminding that migration is not a niche issue, but one impacting over 270 million people and more, including their families and host communities, affecting issues of human rights, development, and health, amongst others. The majority of migrants move between countries in a way that is safe, orderly, and regular. Migration itself is overwhelmingly positive for migrants and their societies. However, when unregulated, migration presents challenges, often leaving migrants vulnerable to abuse and exploitation while stoking hostile anti-migrant situations. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mazen. We'll now turn to Demetrios.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here, and I thank my Turkish colleagues who invited me. I also want to thank the last presenter, because he made my job quite a bit easier by, describing a document that has 511, components to it. I made the number up. Don't think that that's the actual number. You did a great job in being able to emphasize what's most important. So, what I will try to do is basically reduce a 2-hour presentation to 12 minutes and focus on a very simple question, which goes something like that. If this document and what it proposes is so important, and it is such a, remarkably thoughtful document that balances interests, where there are no winners and losers, and where no one gains disproportionately out of any particular element of it, why has it become so divisive? And that's what I will focus on. Why do we have, and do we continue to have, so many arguments, both about what the document says in some ways, but most importantly, what the document doesn't say, and allows, therefore, people to sort of draw their own conclusions. And I'll start with something with which I will also finish. This is the fate of ambitious enterprises, initiatives, particularly on the part of international organizations that are conceived during one era, they get concluded during a different era, and they get implemented during a different era yet. Now you can say, how could a 5-year period starting, let's say, sometime in 2014, 2015, and now we're only 2019, in a sense, incorporate 3 different eras? By that I mean that things have changed so dramatically between when it was conceived, when it was signed and ratified, and what is implemented. And what has changed is that two things in particular became highly problematic today during the third era. Namely, our belief in the fact that migration and multilateralism may not be the way to go as we're moving forward. In other words, the skepticism that grew dramatically during the last 4 or 5 years about both migration and multilateralism is at the very heart of what governments, particularly governments that worry about loss of sovereignty, have been trying to address, and in the process have been attacking or moving away from the goals of the Global Compact. And at the very heart of it is words that the Global Compact does not use, but as we all know, you don't have to use words, you only have to imply these words in order for people to attack something that they don't like. And of course, the most highly allergic term in all of this migration and multilateralism sort of universe is global governance. That is the idea that somehow states and the people that make up states will submit a decision or a set of decisions that goes to the very heart of who they are to some sort of a supranational institution. I know that's not what the compact says, but it doesn't really matter. It's how people read it, particularly when smart people find the right smart words to attack it. The compact has within it a remarkable and amazing paradox. On the one hand, we are allergic to anything that may chip away from our sovereign right to make decisions about who comes in, under what circumstances, and when. And on the other hand, we find out that when crises happen, we become very quickly eager to sort of have greater international cooperation and build more partnerships. No other example is better to sort of point to this paradox than what is happening in the south part of the United States, and the way that the United States, that was the first country to abandon the process and attack the process back in 2017, a long time ago, to now cut deals, not fair deals, but cut deals, cooperative deals with Mexico, the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, and having deals, bilaterals and regional, going further south and further south as a means of immunizing itself from unwanted flows of migrants. So what are some of the preliminary lessons that at least I have learned from this process? First of all, it's something that we all know, intuitively, or we have experienced it, which is unilateralism. I didn't say sovereignty, I said unilateralism is less and less effective. There's no doubt about it. No one would really argue with that. The second one is sovereignty and bilateral and regional cooperation. I don't want to go to the global, it gets too complicated. I have a small mind, so I don't want to go all the way there. But bilateral and regional cooperation is in fact compatible with the two, the issue of cooperation and with the issue of sovereignty. In other words, you can really stand on your sovereign rights to do X, Y, and Z, and at the same time enter into cooperative agreements and partnerships with countries in the region. And by doing so, not only do you not lose sovereignty, but you actually contribute and support sovereignty better. It doesn't make, it's not logical on its face, but if you think about it, you will see the connection. And if unilateralism is not very effective, and cooperation does not really affect adversely sovereignty, how can we enhance the probability of cooperation without reawakening the animal spirits of nationalism and native populism? And this may be words that, you in Turkey or people from some parts of the world may not be terribly familiar with, but populism of the right or the left is galloping throughout the world. And that is simply a reality. So, how do we find the sweet spot of when and how to cooperate, and what might be the most, feasible, let's not say easy, but feasible ways of cooperating in ways that they can help us all succeed? Think perhaps of instability-inducing transmigration. If Mexico is willing to cooperate with the United States, it's not just because the United States is pushing Mexico, but because Mexico also understood that if these thousands upon thousands of people from south of Mexico kept coming to Mexico, and if they got stuck at the US-Mexican border, then instability would really become a real political issue for Mexico itself. Hence, a rationale for cooperation. I'm using examples from an area and a geography that I know best, but I am sure, you can come up with your own examples that do the same thing. Another reason to cooperate is that the status quo empowers and enriches all of the bad guys, all of the people who are the gangs and the criminal networks that move and abuse people. So if you want to sort of take the high ground on this, here is a reason to cooperate that is a high ground kind of reason. And of course, at the end, at the bottom of all migration, since our distinguished moderator said that I've been doing this almost forever, I remember that one of the sort of early lessons that anybody who does migration learns is that the first people to leave a country are the most energetic citizens, younger, ready to work hard, and they're what President Obama used to call the strivers, people who work hard and strive to succeed for them and their families, and as a result, offer benefits to the receiving society as well as to their families who stay behind. So what are some of the, if I were to sort of quickly say a few things about 4 major reasons for which underlie why the reaction to the GCM has been as intense as it has been. And you will understand that there is a logic to each one of them. I tend to speak sort of clearly this way that we can all agree on this. There has been a fear that the compact makes no difference whether it's realistic or not, but a fear that the compact would impede states' ability to control and particularly to choose and limit migration. Migration is either a sovereign right to choose and limit it, or it is not. There are countries that think that it is an absolute right and they want to maintain that right. The second one is fear, despite the fact that the compact does not use the words that I'm about to use. There's a fear that the compact blurs the lines between legal and illegal migration. I know that you guys are much nicer people than I am. You say irregular migration. I have never understood what irregular migration means. It's either legal or not legal. So what we have, in a sense, is a concern on the part of opponents of any international cooperative framework that the lines get blurry. The compact correctly has put in the last version something that clearly speaks about legal and illegal, but it doesn't really matter. The third one fears that regardless of the non-binding character of the agreement, everybody mentions in the first 5 words that they say about the compact, the global compact on migration, that it is a non-binding document. Sometimes by emphasizing that it's a non-binding document, you actually emphasize that there is something, sort of fishy about it. So there are concerns about the non-binding character of the agreement, that somehow the agreement will be sort of the camel's nose under the tent. We end up with soft law, and sometime in the future, soft law becomes hard law. And nobody wants to walk down that path. And the final point, and there could be 30 different points, but I decided to just pull, 4 of them. There is an inherent skepticism about a plan that claims that it can benefit everyone. There is no such thing in divisive, difficult issues, a plan. Not even Solomon could create a plan that would really benefit everyone. And the more you say that, sort of the more fake this whole thing sounds. So these are some of the reasons that, have people really worried about what the Global Compact means. But there are also all sorts of other, contributing reasons that make, on an everyday basis, makes it clear that things are not so good in the migration front. And that's the larger context. And if I were to put it in the form of a question, the question would be, how can we crisis-proof migration policies? Is there anything that we can do to prevent migration crises from essentially erupting? Sorry, Beth. And we have to think about climate events, we have to think about demographic imbalances, protracted instability and conflict, and deeply limited livelihood opportunities for vast numbers of people, particularly among the youngest nations and the youngest continent, that is Africa. I will go directly to the end, and I will leave you with 4 takeaways. The first is that in the way that we talk to audiences, but also to each other, we should try to moderate expectations on the part of everyone. Here is an instance where less can be more. We should not oversell these documents, particularly the migration, which is different than the refugee compact. The second one, we have a real hard task ahead of us, and that task is rebuilding public trust in migration management. This is the most consequential victim of the last 5 years. Publics have lost trust in the ability and willingness of their government to actually do the hard things that are necessary to do. Third, avoid, even attack, all references to global governance on migration. I know these are not in the document, but all too often we get excited, we get carried away, and we talk about the values, the importance of global governance. The final thought is that context is always king. When things happen, how they happen, when they're finished, and the fact that you're already in a channel that you cannot really deviate from, sometimes make things very difficult to be implemented by the time that they're finished. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. A lot of provocative ideas in there that we can discuss a little later. Kemal? Sure.
Thank you, Beth. Thanks to the organizers. I'm delighted to be here, and I'd like to pick up the relay from where Demetrios has left. I cannot match him in all senses of the word in terms of experience, but also physical stature. so I better remain seated in my chair. I'd like to pick it up right from where he left, the final couple of remarks, and look into GCR, the Global Compact on Refugees, but try to argue that it is really possible to put into place some of the ideas that the Global Compact on Refugees puts forward, if especially the political will is there. The way I want to go about my brief remarks is I'll say a few words about the twin brother of the Compact on Migration, a few words about the actual content of it, and then how it applies to Turkey, or how we could use the Turkey case to demonstrate that what I consider to be innovative ideas in the Compact on Refugees be mobilized and put into action. I believe that Turkey is critical because just as Turkey played an important role, maybe not a central, but important role in putting together the 1951 Geneva Convention on relating to the status of refugees. Not many people will know, but the Vice President of the Plenipotentiary Conference that concluded the convention was a Turkish diplomat. Just as then, today too, the Turkish Foreign Ministry, but the government as well, has played an important role in pushing the Global Compact on Refugees forward, and that's for very understandable reasons. And the next step with the implementation of the compact will be the Global Refugee Forum in December, and Turkey is amongst a handful of countries that is organizing the forum. The background to the Global Compact is the European migration crisis. Many of you will recall it from your personal experiences and following the media during the summer of 2015. The kind of migration that led more than 1 million refugees and migrants. It was a mixed movement moving on foot to the European Union countries, particularly Germany. The crisis was such that it shook the foundations of the European Union, and at the time, hopefully and prematurely, there were arguments that this could culminate in the Union actually collapsing. Fortunately, that this did not happen. Secondly, it also took place against the background of growing recognition that the 1951 convention, which organized or constituted the basis for addressing refugee movements, was challenged. Some even argued that it was broken. The reason for it is that the convention puts forward 3 durable solutions to refugee situations, starting with the most preferred one, return. The ability to go back to the countries where they had to flee from in dignity and also in a sustainable manner. Over the last couple of decades, it became evident that the situations of refugees were becoming more and more protracted. They could not go back to their countries because of the manner in which political crises were not getting resolved. And a good case in point is what's happening in Syria, but Afghanistan can also be mentioned, and I won't go through the long list. The second durable solution advocated is local integration, the idea of refugees eventually becoming part and fully fledged members of the societies that initially hosted them. The general reaction of host countries so far and governments, for the reasons that partly Demetrios made references to, have been shy, and the local integration option has often been referred to as the forgotten option. And I think we're living it in Turkey too, the notion that Syrian refugees, let alone other refugees, could ever become citizens of Turkey is an extremely touchy subject, and this is the case also for many other host countries. Finally, there was resettlement, the notion that third countries would receive some of the refugees in solidarity with host communities. In the last couple of years or decade or so, with the rise of the right and xenophobia and anti-immigrant feelings in traditional resettlement countries, the resettlement path has pretty much been closed. The UNHCR has long aspired and worked towards this resettlement, but in the case of Turkey and many other countries, less than 1% of refugees have been settled. It's against this picture, the picture provoked by the migration crisis and the recognition that the Geneva system is challenged, opened the way to the New York summit in September 2016, and then from then grew the effort to put together the Global Compact on Refugees. What does it suggest? It establishes for itself 4 goals, and those are the notion that the rest of the international community must share, and there's a play of words there. Instead of the classic burden sharing, the term has become responsibility sharing with countries that are hosting very large number of refugees. And that's captured by this diplomatic language called ease pressure on host countries. A second option, a second objective there is to support the conditions in the origins of the country of origin so that refugees can eventually be repatriated, returned. That's a tall objective, the kind of objective that Demetrios led him in the context of the Migration Compact to say how challenging implementation will be. A third objective is to enhance the self-reliance of refugees. This is critical. The notion that rather than extend them ad infinitum humanitarian assistance, why not make an effort to increase their access to livelihood and enable them to stand on their own feet and enjoy some dignity as well. And lastly, a new concept, a very important concept that I think ought to be better understood and recognized in Turkey too, the Global Compact on Refugees adopts the notion of whole society approach, that whatever is done by the international community, it has to be done in a manner that also benefits and support the host communities. Very quickly, a couple of remarks in the context of Turkey. The compact, as I said, is very interesting to read. It's a long document, but also puts forward a series of innovative ideas. And what we have done in Brookings is run a project to try to take some ideas from there and actually apply them to the situation in Turkey. The reference point for this, for one of the innovative ideas, comes from the following logic. The logic is that to enable refugees to have better access for livelihood possibilities, meaning give them better access to formal employment, why don't we try to expand the pie, expand the economy, bring about economic growth so that there is a demand for the labor of refugees themselves. because so far the focus has tended to be on improving the employability of refugees. In the specific case of Turkey, for example, teach them Turkish, teach them vocational skills, and hope that the labor market will find ways of employing it. But the compact also offers additional ideas in relation to what I just referred to. And one concrete example of the implementation of such an idea comes from the European Union Jordanian Compact that was adopted in 2016 as the international community was preparing for the New York summit I made references to. What does the compact says? The compact says, very briefly and very simplistically, it says the European Union will open up parts of its internal market to industrial products that are coming from Jordan, in return for Jordan issuing work permits to Syrian refugees in Jordan. The compact's experience, the EU-Jordanian compact's experience so far has had minuses and pluses, but what I see is a determination on both parts to continue to implement this compact. The EU-Jordanian compact is not suited to Turkey because Turkey has already a customs union with the European Union. But it is possible to arrange a system where the European Union can extend trading concessions, for example, in the agricultural area, in return for Turkey ensuring that the many Syrian refugees who are already employed informally and in deep precarity in the agricultural sector of Turkey moved into formal employment, and these trade concessions can be made conditional to the formal employment of refugees. And the resulting end product would be an economic growth in there, a kind of growth that benefits the Syrian refugees as well as host community members. This is also a way out from a recognition that the prospects, contrary to what is being said publicly in Turkey, of the refugees returning to Syria is not realistic, and that the Syrian refugees are increasingly becoming integrated into the Turkish community, and I suspect Murat Hocam may be saying a few words as years go by on it. And this is where I will stop and look forward to the Q&A session.
Thank you, Kemal. We'll now turn to Murat Erdoğan.
Hello everyone, welcome to all of you. I had the opportunity to welcome everyone yesterday, but it's lovely that Istanbulites flock to a meeting that starts at 9 a.m. in the middle of the week despite traffic. It's wonderful to see Beth and Dimitri on the same panel. It's always a pleasure. Today, I'd like to dwell upon the topic of the Turkish context, basically, in the context, in the larger context of the refugee crisis and migration, and I'd also like to adopt a critical stance on this issue. So, looking back at the past 8 years, which areas were more problematic in terms of the migration crisis and which were easier to handle? So, these figures and these statements are all too familiar to all of us. Nevertheless, I'd like to pinpoint a couple of highlights. Dimitri said it already. It's very important whom we are talking to, whom we are speaking to. When we're speaking about migration in general, we say something else. When we talk about the concrete example of the migration crisis and the migrants that came to Turkey, then we speak an entire different language. And I believe that this very crisis will create a framework for future crises which will surely occur, with which we will handle this crisis. I was just recently in Canada. Canada officially receives more than 300,000 migrants, but from Turkey, from Jordania and other countries, they received 25,000 Syrian refugees, and this is all they've been talking about ever since. So this is really funny in my eyes. Only a small portion of all the refugees make it to the so-called developed countries, to industrialized countries, and it's a real hopeless journey. Let's take a look at the breakdown of refugees, where they are to be found in the world. 6.5 million Syrian refugees. Where are they to be found? 15% are in Europe or Canada, the US. The rest is to be found in Turkey, Jordania, and in other regional countries, so neighborhood countries. This is not going to change. So the more vulnerable countries in the world have been and will be receiving more refugees when compared to the developed countries. The top 10 countries has a new member, just a recent addition, which is Germany. But apart from that, nothing much has changed. In the top 10, Turkey is really at the top, which is a nice change to rank highest in one of the top 10, in any of the top 10 lists that are available. So it's a nice change for Turkey. But of course, we need to talk about fundamental rights and freedoms of refugees as well, which is a very problematic area. Up until now, Turkey is keeping 600,000 refugees, Syrian refugees, right on the other hand side of the border, and no one is criticizing that. Not from the international community, not from the local authorities, and all the criticism is reflected right back, because Turkey's argument is, well, enough is enough. I've already received so many refugees, so I have to keep a portion of them somewhere. So as days go by, this crisis will further deteriorate, I believe, and the Syrian example will be a milestone in the world history of refugee crises, and our situation is not good. Security is another issue. The refugee crisis goes hand in hand with the issue of security. At least that is what the public says. So instead of NATO intervening in Syria and doing something on location, they're trying to negotiate refugee rights and whatnot. So this is really a reflection of how dire and how problematic this situation is. So Turkey is, of course, in a geographically very unique situation. Turkey is a country that is internally also not stable, but our neighborhood, our surroundings are even more unstable. So imagine the Syrian situation in 10 years, for example. Will it be one unified country? Will it be 4 countries? What is going to be the outcome and the result, the consequence on Iraq and Iran? Will there be a new negotiation round that is going to be opened? So it's a really problematic issue. So Syria is, of course, not the first experience what with migration, but it is the largest and the most problematic, of course. And Turkey has always been in a position where the Turkish aristocracy, so to speak, granted citizenship to anyone that came to the country with the effort, with the target in mind to create a nation state. But now the number of Syrian refugees is so high that the situation became unmanageable in Turkey. It's well, and of course the situation has many sub-dimensions to it as well, ethnic divisions and so on and so forth. So Turkey as a country, as a host country, needs to adopt its own measures to handle the situation. Unfortunately, the situation that we're in right now and the dramatization of the situation by Europe will only play into the hands of the dictators in the region. So Europe will, since it plays into the hands of the dictators, will further strengthen the dictatorship in these countries. This is what we have been experiencing in Turkey. We back in 2011 have been talking about 58,000 roughly refugees. Coming to 2019, we speak about more than 4.1 million refugees, and the latest number was even higher, and the number is constantly increasing, and that includes the non-Syrian refugees as well. So Mr. Kirişci mentioned the new concept of responsibility sharing, but it looks like the responsibility lies only in the hands of a very few countries. When a new deal is supposed to happen, if a new deal happens in the near future, then we definitely need to take into consideration not only the Syrian refugees, but all other refugees as well, non-Syrian refugees as well. There are roughly 100,000 Syrian refugees that have been naturalized, that have adopted the Turkish citizenship, but this number is increasing. Of course, the numbers are confusing, and we've discussed this with Katerina yesterday as well. Are these solid figures when we see such figures, such numbers? Are these official numbers when, according to the Migration Authority, these numbers are final and official? It's of course not easy to carry out an inventory, a demographic inventory of Syrian refugees. No one knows where they are scattered around in the country. So the process is ongoing, but this is not going to change anything. The numbers can be high as 3 million. The numbers can be as high as 10 million, because the impact, the societal impact on the host country is very significant, and we are already going through this tremendous and very deep and significant change in the country. But unfortunately, this issue is still very much ignored in the country. If it weren't ignored, if it wasn't ignored, then we would see something about it in the news constantly and everywhere. The ratio of Syrians to the Turkish general non-Syrian population is 4.47. Peu à peu, little by little, in the last couple of years, this has increased up to 4.47, and it looks like it's going to increase in the future as well. And when we say Syrians, we have to say that roughly 100,000 already became citizens. There are a couple of other people, roughly 60,000, that are waiting for their naturalization process to be initiated, and there are roughly 100,000 Syrians that await that are in Turkey on a residence permit. So the newborn babies issue in Turkey, which is very much discussed about, the number of Syrian babies born in Turkey has increased very much. The daily newborn refugee Syrian baby number is 465, and the number of 0 to 4-year-old children is more than 500,000. So this brings along with it a couple of other issues, because there needs to be housing, proper housing, educational facilities, and so on and so forth, of course. What about there is no settlement program in Turkey as such. Maybe this is the most liberal Syrian refugee settlement program in the world, because everyone had the freedom to settle where they wanted to. And the Istanbul governorship said there are too many Syrians in Istanbul, send them back to Gaziantep, for example, or to other places.
If Turkey had a settlement program from the very beginning, it could have meant something, but that was not the case. Until 2017, everyone went to wherever they wanted to go, and Erdoğan had started to make some explanations, which is prohibiting that. Wherever you are registered, you have to stay there, he told. I don't believe that this policy, personally speaking, is not applicable from the perspective of the Turkish regulations or the international law. You might have a dozen of discussions, but after 8 years, you know, making the decision where the refugees are going to stay, I think somehow it should be left to the initiative of those people, because it's not controllable, and there you are creating some other victimizations. 8 years is not long, is not short. Well, temporary protection status, but as the name suggests, it's temporary, for God's sake, and this is not something which could be sustainable for 2 decades. It has to be transferred into something. Even if you have the status as such, mobility has to continue. Just don't forget that mobility has not created such a turmoil. And on top of that, even though there were so many imbalances in Kilis, pointing out to 80% of the population, in Hatay 24%, or in another part, on Antep 40%, even those cities where the actual ones suffered, the rate in Istanbul is 3.6%. Istanbul is #1 complainer, but actually the ones which are supposed to complain are cities such as Antep, Kilis, and so forth. And we have to revise that. And the most important thing which we see at the heart of this forum, they are urban refugees. We coexist together. So actually we have to create policies for these people. And Turkey is rather problematic in that sense, because it's not only a humanitarian crisis, because at the same time it happens to be a political crisis. Why did we have that crisis in the first place? People are putting, the blame on one another. We might be right, because the decision makers, AK Parti, Davutoğlu, Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, they made a decision or failed to take a decision, or they had wrong forecasts. Well, this is actually a field of discussion. And the opposition in Turkey thinks it's rather easy. Well, the government made a mistake. If they correct it, the problem is going to be alleviated or corrected. If we continue seeing them as problems, refugees, I'm so sorry, don't take no offense, but these people will stay. It doesn't matter which ideology you are from, MHP, AK Parti, or, CHP. Those people, you have to simply continue living with those people and create policies for those. And, about the municipalities in such panels, I think we are going to have discussions. Barbara came all the way from Netherlands. What could be the role of the local administrations and municipalities? And Well, actually, we need to have stronger local initiatives. We need to hear their sound more. And for such an imbalanced and distributed population, you can't have actually a fully fledged cohesion policy. That's why we have to have the local initiatives, and local cohesion processes should be implemented. So we have a number of general in order to describe the Turkish situation, I would like to give you some figures. For people who are enrolled in education status, these belong to the last year 650,000 Syrian children enrolled at schools. This is rather problematic, but still somehow, even though we assume that it's rather successful, 700,000 children, but we have lost generations which are still work in progress. It goes on. This is one of the biggest problems of Turkey, because they belong to Turkey. Whatever you do, despite all the efforts of Turkey, this is one of the most positive figures in Turkey. More than 27,000 Syrian university students are studying in Turkey. We have Katerina here, they know that. And on average in the world, the high school contribution rate of refugees is around 1%. And in Turkey, it is more than 5%. It is actually, driving the global average upwards. This is an important aspect. This is going to be one of the most important aspects of the cohesion policy of Turkey. We need such intellectuals, such role models who are the pioneers. A number of things about the cohesion or integration. So we have two parts, two axes, vertical and horizontal. We have the state and we have the society. No matter what you as a state, the social acceptance is of very big importance. Whatever the society thinks, to what extent they are ready, you have to consider. You can't ignore them. It doesn't matter, citizenship, house, or status, whatever the state gives. 102,000 Syrian people have become citizens. Are their problems over? So, social acceptance is so important in terms of the integration. On the other hand, as we say all the time, that's sort of bilateral integration. The newcomers should make an effort, but so should the society. That's how we should designate it. So why? We have we have concerns in terms of mass influxes of people, particularly for the refugees as well as the migrants. People will lose their work. There would be concerns in terms of an increase in criminality, reduction of public services, or this could be problematic, or maybe a threat against identity, or loss of identity. Vis-a-vis the Syrians, that's my personal thesis. In Turkey, because of the Syrians, the loss of work has not practically happened. There are good and bad sides to that. The good news is that, Syrians were able to survive on their own, and in the informal sector, they were able to construct their own lives. That was good. But there is a huge abuse of labor, so much so that this is not sustainable. Those people are suffering in the informal sector. But if Turkey could had tried to simply include them into the formal industry, well, it could have not happened, because the youth employment is more than 29%. For more than 4.5 million Turkish citizens are without a job. So you can't afford to offer employment for them. So even though we don't want it and it's not ideal, informal sector was one of the most important instruments in terms of the cohesion, offered prospects both for Turkish people and Syrian people. There was minimum increase in criminality, and actually that was a huge chance. Mainly Syrian people suffered, and actually that was sort of put a control on that. Reduction in the public services in the southern part, that was rather obvious. That's why in every line of work we do, that tension in that region is always at a higher level. That's why. So the identity is sort of the problem of the elitist people of the Ankara or the Istanbul people. So we have some more time to discuss whether, we are becoming Syrian or Arab, like so and so forth. So I would like to say a number of things about why social acceptance level is in Turkey very high. I think cultural solidarity, but this is what we saw in the initial 3 years. But there was this understanding. People thought that they're going to come, we will help them, and they will leave. And then reactions soared because people started to understand that they're not going to leave. Domestic mobility. Even the residents of Turkish Republic are very mobile in the country. In 82 million, 3 million Turkish citizens migrated to another city from their original city. European societies are rather stabilized. It's rather difficult for them to understand that. And accepting the newcomers is even more difficult. So 25 years ago, the population of Istanbul used to be 6, now it's 16. Ankara, it used to be 1, now it's 4 million. There is an increase, there is a mobility all the time. And newcomers, are they Turkish, Kurdish, Afghan, or Syrian? Sociologically speaking, it is very important, and it is actually sort of an enabler. People could understand that. I talked about the huge informal sector, and the unregistered industry actually is helping people survive, and it keeps the threats of losing the Turkish people's own jobs is kept at a minimum level, and low-level criminality and expectations even today. They're going to go one day. So, the Turkish society is not that naive, or, that's rather becoming more problematic. I'm going to skip those. And the last, solidarity, particularly the sharing of responsibility. So this is actually a typical example. Kemal Bey gave his further examples between EU and Turkey. Well, there was an agreement of sharing responsibilities. That's what it seems. But actually, a very simple solution for a very complicated problem. EU will pay, and they're going to keep the refugees in Turkey. And there is nothing sustainable about that. And as a model per se, but I'm not belittling the fact that EU actually is the biggest financier of, the finance provider. I'm not ignoring that, and they also brought capacity. I'm not actually simply belittling that. However, the externalization reflects putting everything outside. It has so much fitted EU. So in terms of the sharing of the responsibility and liability, both cohesion, integration. My last 1 minute, the safety, even the cohesion integration. So, is going to be put on the shoulders of Turkey. And I don't think that's sustainable. Why? Because on the other party, Turkish Republic is actually seeing everything as an instrument. Refugees is sort of the biggest thing, We're doing great things, they're not paying. We're doing this, they're not doing that. So it's sort of actually playing that way. And democracy and the perception of West in Turkey is actually something very misfortunate. And, we actually switch from a position of we used to be the country which was negotiating its EU accession, and now we have become merely a country which is negotiating the deal of refugees. But we have seen the creation of new industries in Turkey, and there's a huge experience. Unfortunately, this is the great picture which is depicting the sharing of responsibility. In the last 2 years, thanks to Turkey Housing Administration, it has erected a wall which is more than 900 kilometers. Well, it's not only for the refugees, but after Chinese wall, this is the second largest and longest wall which is erected on our borders. And European Union was actually very supportive. That's where they share the responsibility. That is a great indicator of the fact that, the progress we have made. One last bit. I'm going to talk about the Syrian Barometer. And Mazen is here. And I have been conducting this since 2014. In 2014, IOM helped us, and I'm always indebted to them. And we continue now. And now UNHCR, Katerina and her team are kind enough to support us. And in 1 month, we're going to publish the latest results. But 2 things I have to mention. On one hand, we have an increased tension in Turkey, and that irritation, that concern, that anxiety among the Turkish society. And among the Syrian people, they are actually feeling at home every day at an increased level. We ask the Syrian people in Şanlıurfa, in survey, do you feel that you have integrated into Şanlıurfa and Turkey? 97% said yes. So now you ask the Turkish community, they give different responses. Integrate to what is another line of discussion, but there's a new experience that we are receiving. We are rediscussing everything, what we have to do in terms of the rights of the refugees, an honorable life, and for the peace of Turkey, cohesion integration policies, which has to be based on the local cohesion. International solidarity, will that be ever possible? Well, it's not very possible for us to be optimistic within this given framework. But at least the fact that it is discussed under the leadership of Turkey is something positive, and we are very happy about that. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Murat, and thanks to all of our panelists for good insights on complicated issues. Do we have time for a few questions? Maybe I'll begin then. Dimitri, we just heard from Murat the mixture of securitization and migration policy. Did you see that at the global level as well? Please go ahead. Could you turn off that mic? Can you turn off that mic?
Certainly, I see that in different parts of the world, and I would imagine, I'm sorry. Go ahead, okay. I would imagine that in even global conversations, you know, the security component of this plays a role. So yes, the answer is I see that.
Okay, and I wonder for both Murat and Kemal, you know, the whole purpose of the Global Compact on Refugees was to share responsibility. From a Turkish perspective, do you feel like the international community is sharing that responsibility with Turkey?
Dünyanın
Well, for the past 5 to 6 years, because of the high flux of refugees, I see an effort of creating new solutions. And there has been a division of resource countries and countries that are considered transit countries, and taking them on board as well, and trying to negotiate stuff. It is nevertheless a relation of interest, but this is legit nevertheless, because we have very, very high numbers of refugees in flocking to Europe, and this brings along with it a solid political crisis, and Europe is struggling to solve this crisis. And this, of course, has a reflection on internal politics as well. I do hold the worry that this situation might lead to a more ethnocentric political consequence in Turkey. Maybe Turkey needs to step away from emotion. Turkey is approaching many issues with a lot of emotions. That has always been like this. But in the end, at the end of the day, this is going to be a political decision, whatever decision is going to be taken. So if Turkey establishes relationships with its neighboring countries and the international community on a non-emotional basis, that would be good, I believe. But I think that we also should step away from we should step away from the fact that Turkey is constantly showing the broom of refugees. It's always showing the threat of refugees wherever they are sitting on at the table with the international community. I'm not too optimistic, but nevertheless, at least the least we can do is to provide the refugees a dignified life, a life where they can ensure their own livelihood and lead a decent life. And the main responsibility will always lie with the host communities, so there is not going to be too much of a responsibility sharing in my eyes. But if we ethnicize, so to speak, this issue, this will be very, very problematic for Turkey, and also will only play into the hands of the dictators in the region. Thank you.
Expressed my thoughts in a much more eloquent and nuanced manner. I support his observation. The way I look at it, Turkey has two paths to choose from when it comes to working with the international community. One is the path that the Turkish public daily gets exposed through I'm sorry to say it, through a controlled media, which is beating the international community and especially the European Union as hard as possible. That's one approach. The other approach is to be much more constructive as well as critical. I think there is no harm in saying that the international community ought to do more, especially the European Union. But it is also important, as Murat has pointed out, to recognize that the European Union and leading Western countries are the ones that are extending help to Turkey, even if it's limited. And maybe without worrying about it, say that countries like Russia and China contribute absolutely nothing to the Turkish efforts, let alone to the Jordanian and Lebanese efforts. And maybe it's also important to recognize in Turkey that the presence of 3.6 million Syrians in Turkey is not the only problem as far as the international community goes. I've just mentioned Lebanon and Jordan, especially Lebanon, where almost 1 person in 4 is a refugee in a very weak state. But there are also similar challenges elsewhere in the world, and mostly, as Murat pointed out in his presentation, 85% of refugees are in developing countries. I think this picture needs to be recognized. I personally believe, I may be naive and maybe too optimistic, I believe that Turkey can manage this challenge, and if the second path is chosen, a lot of positive steps can be taken, and that it would be beneficial to Turkey. But one observation that I've been dying to make, a positive one, resulting from the presence of Syrian refugees and others, that and the international contribution that is being made to Turkey, is that I see more and more and more young Turks working with international non-governmental organizations, working with international agencies like the UNHCR, like the UNDP, like IOM, the World Bank, etc. This is very important, and it's going to pay back Turkey very generously in 10, 15 years down the line. These are experiences that my generation could have not dreamt of. And in 10, 15 years' time, we will be seeing young Turks, or who will have aged a little bit and become 35, 40, in middle and higher ranks of these organizations. And this will bring a plus to Turkey.
Thank you, Kemal. I have one short question for Mazen, and then we have a question from the app, and then I think we'll have to close. But for Mazen, you know, the new UN network on migration is kind of following in the footsteps of the Global Migration Group, which was not seen as very effective. Why do you think the network will do things differently?
I think we will need to give some time for the network in order to prove itself. So far, it has been established for less than 1 year. And then if we look at the work plan that they have established, it's a bit ambitious, but I think it can be done if everyone will be committed to it. So let's give it at least till mid of 2020 when they start to issue the inputs for the first Secretary General report and to implement few activities, and then I think we will be in a better position to evaluate their efficiency.
That's fair enough. This is a very short time period that we're looking at. Dimitri, and then we'll go to the audience question.
I think that they also have an exceptional director, executive director, whatever you call it, you know, who's experienced and who knows how to move slowly enough when it's necessary and fast when the opportunity arises. So this is also, I hate to reduce it to the personality and the qualifications of the person who is responsible for it, but in this particular case, Jonathan Prentice is one of those exceptional people.
Thank you. And the question we received from the app is, you know, does the responsibility sharing in the Global Compact have the support of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council? And if not, is it in fact sustainable? This is a nice little political question to end with. Kemal, you want to jump in?
Well, further to what I've just said, only 3 members of the permanent permanent members of the Security Council have been supporting this kind of exercise internationally for some time. The other two, I want to be brutal, tends to stick the spanner in the wheels and especially one of them aggravates the crises, and we see it on a daily basis right next door. I doubt I'll ever be able to travel to that country having said what I've just said, though I wish I could.
Thanks, Murat.
That actually, I would like to hear you, and then your also view, because you have also experience in UN, and then you can say us how realistic is that, and then what is the approach?
Okay, that turns the question back to me. I mean, I think in effect that these global compacts represent something for everyone. I know you don't agree, Dimitri, but for rich countries, it's a way of supporting host countries in part so that refugees don't continue to travel on. It has something for host countries to feel at least more international support. You look at the 4 objectives of the Global Compact on refugees, they're really all about host countries. They're not really about refugees. You don't hear, refugees to live in dignity and so forth is one of the objectives. The objective is to support host countries, to enable refugees to go home, to support self-reliance, all of which is in the interest of both the host countries, but also at least 3 of the 5 permanent members. Okay, I'm sorry we were kind of running out of time here. I think this is characteristic of most. Oh, Kemal has 1 more minute. Okay, Kemal.
I've come all the way from across the Atlantic. I'd like to make one more observation. I tend to get criticized for taking the views I've tried to share with you, but we must not forget that the Turkish Republic and its predecessor, the Ottoman Empire, was based on migration, just is the case, for example, with the United States. And the Turkish Republic has managed to integrate waves of migration into Turkey. We don't have the time to go into the details of it. Murat Hocam flagged out how many of them are from Türk soyu ve kültüründen. Yes, but amongst them there were people who didn't speak Turkish, like Albanians, for example, or Pomaks, or Tatars, or Circassians. And I think Turkey, if today Turkey has still some prestige internationally and some strength in the economic sense of the word and social sense of the word, it is because of this experience. And I believe that Turkey will, in the long run, be able to integrate this wave of refugees as well, especially the younger generation, and it will contribute to strength of Turkey. The key there is to take the positive perspective and to engage the international community constructively so that they can share some of that responsibility. Thanks, Fred.
Thank you, and thank you as well for ending on a positive note, or looking at the contributions that migrants have made, not only to Turkey, but to most of the countries to which they have gone. Well, thank you all very much, and enjoy your next session.